Alongside the personal grief that all my family are feeling, we also share with so many of you in the United Kingdom.
The cameras captured every tremor in his hands as King Charles III stepped before the world on that gray March morning. His voice, usually measured and composed, carried an unmistakable weight, the sound of a man forced to choose between the woman he loved and the institution he had waited 70 years to lead. Behind him, the Queen Mary's crown sat in its display case, a silent witness to 1,000 years of monarchy, now facing one of its most devastating internal crises. "It is with profound sadness," Charles began, his words carefully chosen yet heavy with emotion, "that I must announce a temporary suspension of Her Majesty Queen Camilla's royal duties and titles, pending a full investigation into matters concerning the royal collection." The room fell silent. Reporters froze, their pens suspended mid-stroke. Around the world, millions watching the broadcast felt the earth shift beneath the British monarchy. This wasn't a routine announcement about schedules or charitable patronages. This was the King of England publicly distancing himself from his queen, a woman he had loved for decades, defended against public scorn, and finally married despite a nation's skepticism. What could possibly have driven Charles to this unprecedented action? What discovery could be so damaging that it forced a king to choose his crown over his heart? The answer lay in a small sapphire brooch, a Geneva auction house, and secrets that reached back to the most tumultuous chapter in modern royal history. The scandal began not with headlines or official investigations, but with a simple auction catalog circulated among Europe's elite collectors in January 2025. Nestled among Edwardian tiaras and Victorian bracelets was a sapphire and diamond brooch of exquisite craftsmanship, Art Deco styling, platinum setting, with Ceylon sapphires of remarkable clarity. The piece was striking enough to warrant attention, but it was the provenance description that caught the eye of eagle-eyed royal watchers. Previously in a distinguished British collection, circa 1980s, royal jewelry experts immediately recognized something troubling. The design matched perfectly with a brooch Princess Diana had worn to several high-profile events in the mid-1980s, including a state visit to Austria in 1986. Photographs from the period showed Diana wearing what appeared to be an identical piece, the distinctive teardrop sapphire arrangement, the specific platinum scrollwork, even the particular way the light caught the stones. Yet according to official records, all of Diana's jewelry had been catalogued after her death in 1997, with major pieces allocated to her sons, William and Harry, and subsequently to their wives. The auction house, under pressure from British authorities and facing questions about the legitimacy of the consignment, pulled the lot from sale within 48 hours of the catalog's publication. But the damage was done. Royal correspondents began asking uncomfortable questions. How had a piece from Diana's collection ended up at a Geneva auction? Who had consigned it? And most troublingly, what did this reveal about the security and management of the royal jewelry collection, one of the most valuable private collections in the world? The initial response from palace officials was dismissive. Surely it was a case of mistaken identity, they suggested. Many brooches from that era shared similar designs. Without physical examination, definitive attribution was impossible, but the resemblance was too precise and the photographs too clear. Independent jewelry historians began examining archival images, cross-referencing with the auction photographs. The evidence mounted. This wasn't just a similar brooch, it was Diana's brooch. The scandal deepened when investigators traced the consignment paperwork. The brooch hadn't been submitted by some anonymous foreign collector or shady middleman. The trail, though deliberately obscured through multiple intermediaries, led back to England. More specifically, it led to Wiltshire, to a region where only one royal residence stood, Raymill House, Camilla's private retreat that she had maintained even after becoming queen consort. The implications were staggering and impossible to ignore. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense approach to royal protocol and her fierce protection of the monarchy's integrity, demanded action. In a private meeting with Charles that courtiers later described as tense and unusually direct, Anne insisted on a comprehensive audit of the royal jewelry registry. Not just the sapphire brooch, but everything. Every tiara, every necklace, every historically significant piece that comprised the collection. If one item had gone missing, how many others might have disappeared? The situation had escalated from a potential embarrassment to a full-blown crisis that threatened the monarchy's reputation for stewardship of national treasures. The Royal Jewelry Registry, maintained by the Royal Collection Trust, is one of the most detailed inventories in existence. Every piece is photographed, documented, and tracked with meticulous precision. Loans are recorded, returns verified, and provenance maintained with archival thoroughness. The system was designed to be foolproof, a safeguard against loss, theft, or unauthorized disposal of items that weren't just valuable, but historically significant. Pieces that told the story of British royalty across centuries. The audit, conducted in absolute secrecy over 3 weeks in February 2025, revealed cracks in what had been presumed an impenetrable system. Several pieces showed irregularities in their documentation. Transfer records were incomplete, lacking required signatures, or showing signatures that didn't match official specimens. Some loans to family members, including Camilla, had never been officially returned to the collection, though they weren't marked as permanent transfers. Most troublingly, several items that should have been in the collection couldn't be located, their whereabouts unaccounted for in any official record. The sapphire brooch was just the beginning. Investigators discovered that at least 8 other pieces, including 2 diamond bracelets, a ruby ring, and several brooches, had been signed out for Camilla's use over the past 2 decades, but never formally returned. Some of these items dated back to periods before her marriage to Charles, when she would have had access to royal jewelry for specific events, but not permanent possession. The documentation suggested a pattern of informal borrowing that had never been properly regularized, items that had essentially disappeared into private possession without proper authorization or record-keeping. Even more damaging was the discovery that some documentation had been altered. Computer forensics revealed that entries in the digital registry had been modified, with dates changed and notations added years after the fact. The modifications were sophisticated, but not perfect. Digital fingerprints remained that revealed when changes had been made and from which terminals. Several modifications traced back to computers at Clarence House, Charles and Camilla's official residence, though investigators couldn't definitively determine who had made the actual changes. The atmosphere within royal residences grew increasingly tense as the audit progressed. Charles, briefed regularly on the findings, became visibly strained. Staff members reported seeing him walking the gardens at Highgrove late into the evening, clearly wrestling with the implications of what was being uncovered. William and Catherine, brought into the inner circle of knowledge, began holding their own private discussions about how to protect the monarchy's future. The situation had escalated beyond a simple matter of missing jewelry. It was about trust, integrity, and whether the royal family had been systematically defrauded by one of its own members. Princess Anne pushed for full disclosure and immediate action. Her position was clear and uncompromising. The monarchy's survival depended on public trust, and that trust required transparency and accountability. If Camilla had indeed taken items without proper authorization, if she had sold pieces that belonged to the nation's heritage, then she had to face consequences regardless of her position or her relationship with the king. Anne understood what Charles seemed unable to fully accept, that protecting Camilla would destroy the institution they were sworn to preserve. The discovery of Diana's brooch at auction carried symbolic weight that transcended its monetary value. Diana remained, even nearly 3 decades after her death, the most beloved figure in modern royal history. Her jewelry, particularly pieces she had worn to iconic events, wasn't just valuable, it was sacred to millions who had mourned her passing and elevated her to something approaching sainthood in the public imagination. The possibility that Camilla, the woman widely blamed for the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, the figure who had stood as Diana's antagonist in the public narrative for decades, might have taken Diana's jewelry and sold it for personal profit, was explosive beyond calculation. It seemed to confirm every negative assumption about Camilla that skeptics had harbored for years. The woman who had stolen Diana's husband had now apparently stolen Diana's jewels, selling off pieces of the beloved princess's legacy for her own enrichment. Anne, in her confrontation with Charles, didn't shy away from invoking Diana's memory. The nation loved her, Anne reportedly told her brother in a private meeting that sources described as brutally honest. They tolerated your marriage to Camilla because you convinced them it was about love, that she made you happy. But if they believe she's been stealing from Diana's memory, selling pieces that should have gone to William and Harry, to George, Charlotte, and Louis, there won't be forgiveness, Charles. Not for her, and not for you if you protect her. The emotional impact on William was particularly acute. These weren't just pieces of jewelry. They were his mother's possessions, items he had memories of her wearing, pieces that should have been preserved for his children to understand their grandmother's legacy. The thought that they might have been casually sold off, treated as personal assets rather than family heirlooms, cut deeply. His relationship with Camilla had always been complicated, cordial but never warm, respectful but never affectionate. This scandal threatened to shatter even that careful détente. Catherine, ever diplomatic, found herself in an impossible position. She had worked hard to build a positive relationship with Camilla, recognizing that the family dynamics required cooperation rather than conflict. She had publicly supported Camilla's transition to Queen Consort, understanding that unity was essential for the monarchy's stability. Now she watched her husband grapple with betrayal, saw the pain in his eyes when he looked at photographs of his mother wearing the brooch that had appeared in Geneva. Catherine's loyalty was to William first, but she also understood the broader implications for the institution she would one day help lead. Charles faced a choice that seemed to tear him apart. He had loved Camilla for most of his adult life, had endured decades of public criticism to be with her, had finally given her the title and position he believed she deserved. But he was also king, bound by duties and responsibilities that superseded personal feelings, the crown's integrity, the public's trust, the monarchy's future. All of these weighed against his love for a woman who might have betrayed not just his trust, but the very institution he led. The meeting took place on a cold February evening in one of Clarence House's private drawing rooms. Charles had requested that William, Catherine, and Anne attend what he described only as a family discussion of urgent importance. Camilla, given no advance warning of the meeting's true purpose, arrived expecting a routine discussion of schedules or charitable initiatives. The evidence was laid out systematically and undeniably. The audit findings, the altered documentation, the auction house records, the forensic analysis, everything was presented with clinical precision. Anne, taking the lead in the presentation, spared no detail. Each missing item was shown with photographs of when it had last been officially recorded, when it had been signed out, and why it had never been returned. The sapphire brooch was shown alongside archival photographs of Diana wearing it, the match indisputable. Camilla's reaction, according to those present, moved from disbelief to horror to desperate explanation. She hadn't stolen anything, she insisted. The items had been gifts from Charles over the years, tokens of his affection that she had every right to possess. The brooch specifically, She claimed she hadn't known it had belonged to Diana, that Charles had given it to her years ago, and she'd assumed it came from the general collection, not Diana's personal jewelry. When money had become tight maintaining Ray Mill House and other private expenses, she had made the difficult decision to sell a few pieces, never imagining they would be traced back or that her ownership would be questioned. Charles, visibly torn, pressed for details. When exactly had he given her these pieces? Why weren't the gifts documented in any personal records or correspondence? How could she not have recognized Diana's brooch, given that photographs of Diana wearing it had been published countless times? His questions revealed his own internal struggle, wanting to believe Camilla's explanations while recognizing how implausible they sounded. William remained largely silent during the confrontation, his expression carefully controlled, but his tension evident in every line of his posture. When he finally spoke, his words were measured but devastating. These pieces weren't yours to sell, regardless of how they came into your possession. They're part of our family's history, part of the national heritage. My mother wore that brooch. My children should have inherited it. Instead, it nearly disappeared into a private collection in Geneva, and we're supposed to believe this was all an innocent misunderstanding. Catherine placed a restraining hand on William's arm, a subtle gesture that communicated both support and caution. But her own expression reflected the gravity of the situation. The future king and queen consort were witnessing the present king's personal life colliding catastrophically with his official duties, and they understood that how this was resolved would shape the monarchy for generations. Anne, ever pragmatic, cut to the heart of the matter. The details of who gave what to whom almost don't matter at this point, she said. What matters is public perception. A piece from Diana's collection was about to be sold at auction. Other pieces are missing. Documentation has been altered. Whether through malice or carelessness, the result is the same. The monarchy looks like it can't manage its own affairs, like we're selling off national treasures for personal profit. That perception is toxic, and it has to be addressed decisively. The solution that emerged from that excruciating meeting was unprecedented in modern royal history. Camilla would temporarily relinquish her title and withdraw from all public royal duties pending a complete review of the situation. Charles would make a public statement acknowledging irregularities in the management of the jewelry collection without specifying Camilla's involvement. The investigation would continue privately, and depending on its findings, a decision would be made about Camilla's permanent status within the royal family. For Camilla, it was devastating. Essentially, a public exile, a stripping away of the position she had finally achieved after decades of controversy. For Charles, it was agony, choosing duty over love in the most public and painful way imaginable. For William and Catherine, it was a sobering reminder of the burdens that came with their position. And for Anne, it was the bitter satisfaction of seeing the monarchy's interests placed above personal feelings, however painful that might be. The announcement, when it came in early March, sent shockwaves through Britain and around the world. The carefully worded statement spoke of irregularities in jewelry management and temporary measures to ensure the integrity of the royal collection. But the implications were clear to anyone paying attention. Queen Camilla, the woman who had overcome decades of public disapproval to finally claim her title, was being sidelined in disgrace. British tabloids exploded with speculation and revelation. Within hours, unnamed palace sources were providing additional details. Not everything, but enough to paint a picture of scandal and betrayal. The Daily Mail ran with Crown Jewels scandal. Camilla suspended amid investigation, while the Sun was more direct. Queen in exile. Charles forces Camilla out. International coverage ranged from sympathetic to gleeful, with many outlets unable to resist revisiting the entire history of Charles and Camilla's relationship, painting this as karmic justice for her role in the Diana tragedy. Public reaction split along predictable lines. Diana loyalists, who had never accepted Camilla and had viewed her elevation to queen consort as an insult to Diana's memory, saw vindication. Online forums and social media erupted with "I told you so" posts and calls for Camilla's permanent removal from the royal family. Those who had supported Charles and Camilla's love story expressed disappointment, but acknowledged that if the allegations were true, consequences were necessary. A smaller group defended Camilla, arguing that the situation was likely a misunderstanding being exploited by those who had never wanted her in the royal family to begin with. Within the royal family itself, divisions deepened. Harry reached for comment from his California home, issued a brief statement expressing concern for his father, but declining further comment on what he termed private family matters. The subtext was clear. Harry, who had his own complicated relationship with Camilla and had written about her influence on his father in his memoir, wasn't going to publicly defend her in this crisis. William and Catherine found themselves thrust into an even more prominent role. With Camilla sidelined and Charles emotionally devastated, they became the public face of royal continuity and stability. Catherine, in particular, was praised for her grace under pressure, appearing at scheduled engagements with her characteristic poise while the scandal raged. The media began positioning her as the monarchy's future, the stable, scandal-free royal who would restore dignity to an institution battered by decades of family drama. The strain on Charles was visible to anyone who saw him during this period. He aged seemingly overnight, the weight of his choice etched into every line of his face. In private, according to courtiers, he struggled with profound doubts. Had he made the right choice? Could the monarchy have survived protecting Camilla? Had he betrayed the woman he loved for an institution that might not even survive the modern era? These questions tormented him, leaving him withdrawn and often unable to focus on the daily duties of kingship. Raymill House, once Camilla's cherished private retreat where she had escaped the pressures of royal life, became her prison. Cut off from royal duties, stripped of her title, and facing an uncertain future, she retreated behind the estate's walls and largely disappeared from public view. Staff members who had known her for years reported that she seemed diminished, haunted by the collapse of everything she had worked to achieve. In the privacy of her exile, Camilla reportedly engaged in painful self-reflection. Had she been careless with the jewelry, treating items as personal possessions when they were actually held in trust? Had she allowed financial pressures to cloud her judgment about what was appropriate to sell? Or had she genuinely believed that gifts from Charles were hers to do with as she pleased, not realizing or perhaps not caring that they carried historical significance beyond their monetary value? The photograph from her coronation, the one that had shown her smiling beside Charles, finally achieving the position that had seemed impossible for so many years, was reportedly taken down from its prominent place in her study. She couldn't bear to look at it, sources claimed. Couldn't stand the reminder of how briefly she had held the title of queen before it all came crashing down. Her relationship with Charles, conducted now primarily through lawyers and intermediaries, rather than intimate conversations, suffered immeasurably. Phone calls were brief and awkward, filled with long silences and careful words that avoided the emotional heart of their situation. Charles wanted to visit, wanted to provide comfort and support, but Anne and his advisors counseled against it. Any appearance of the king supporting Camilla, while the investigation continued, would undermine the entire purpose of her suspension, to demonstrate that the monarchy took the scandal seriously and would not protect its own at the expense of institutional integrity. Friends of Camilla, speaking anonymously to sympathetic journalists, painted her as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had never asked for the royal spotlight, who had simply loved Charles and tried her best to fulfill the role thrust upon her, now being sacrificed to protect an institution that had never truly accepted her anyway. But these defenses rang hollow to a public still reeling from the revelation that Diana's jewelry had nearly been sold off without anyone noticing. As spring turned to summer in 2025, the royal family found itself at a crossroads. The investigation into the jewelry scandal continued, though its findings were kept strictly confidential. Camilla remained in exile, her future status unresolved. Charles performed his duties, but seemed diminished, lacking the energy and confidence that had characterized his early months as king. William and Catherine increasingly appeared to be the monarchy's true center of gravity, the couple that represented stability and continuity, while the older generation's dramas played out in painful public view. Behind palace walls, discussions about the monarchy's future grew more urgent and frank. What did the institution need to survive in the 21st century? How much scandal could it endure before public support collapsed completely? Was it possible to restore trust after so many years of family dysfunction played out in headlines? And most pressingly, what would happen when a final determination was made about Camilla's status? Would she be permanently exiled from royal life, or would Charles find a way to bring her back despite the damage to his own reputation? Princess Anne continued to argue for a clear break, insisting that Camilla's permanent removal was necessary to draw a line between the scandal-plagued past and a cleaner future. William and Catherine, while sympathetic to the need for accountability, worried about the impact on Charles and whether destroying his personal happiness was truly necessary for the monarchy's survival. The debates were passionate, with fundamental questions about duty, love, and institutional survival hanging in the balance. The British public, for its part, seemed weary of royal drama. Polls showed declining support for the monarchy, particularly among younger generations who questioned why the country should maintain an expensive, scandal-prone institution in an age of democratic governance. The jewelry scandal became another data point in arguments for abolishing the monarchy entirely, with Republicans arguing that the incident proved the royal family saw public treasures as personal property to be exploited for private gain. Yet the monarchy also retained considerable support, particularly among older Britons who viewed it as a crucial link to history and national identity. These supporters argued that the scandal, while embarrassing, demonstrated that the system worked, wrongdoing had been discovered, action had been taken, and accountability was being enforced. The true test would be whether the institution could learn from the crisis and emerge stronger, more transparent, and more committed to its role as steward rather than owner of national treasures. As the investigation dragged on and Camilla's exile extended from weeks to months, speculation grew about the endgame. Would she ever return to public life? Would Charles abdicate rather than permanently cast aside the woman he loved? Would William push for his father's early abdication to allow a fresh start under his own reign? Or would some compromise be found that allowed Camilla back in a diminished role, her title restored, but her influence permanently curtailed? The answers remained elusive as summer approached, leaving the British monarchy suspended in a state of crisis from which no clear path forward had emerged. What had begun with a sapphire brooch in a Geneva auction catalog had become an existential challenge for an ancient institution struggling to maintain relevance in a modern age that had little patience for royal privilege and less for royal scandal. King Charles's tragic announcement had driven his queen into exile, shattered his own happiness, and raised profound questions about whether the crown he had waited so long to wear was worth the terrible price being paid by everyone around him.